I don't want to name drop, but I first heard about Cheryl Strayed from Nick Hornby. I was talking to him about his last novel, but also what became his trilogy of screenplays about young women. Lynn Barber's An Education that we featured last season on Books on Film, Colm Tóibín's Brooklyn, and Cheryl Strayed's Wild. He told me he's attracted to the warmth and humanity and humor when he's looking for a book to adapt. And what drew him to Wild was that it has so many tones. He said, the literature that I love has that and can switch from funny to serious with ease. That it wasn't written with a hiker's sensibility, which he couldn't relate to anyway. He said he couldn't walk his height on the PCT. But with a liberal arts sensibility that he could relate to. And that's why he approached Reese Witherspoon when he heard that she had the rights to see if he could write the screenplay. And then I remembered Hornby's original review of Wild back in 2012. He doesn't really write reviews, but he, for many years, has had a column in the Believer magazine. He doesn't write reviews because he doesn't believe in wasting space and time and energy panning books. So he does this column for the Believer that's been turned into books. It's made into books as well, serialized. And it's the most wonderful thing because each chapter says books bought, and right on is a list, and under is books read, a smaller list. And this goes on chapter by chapter. However, when it came to Cheryl Strayed's Wild, this is what he wrote. Here's the thing. Cheryl Strayed's Wild is one of the best books I've read in the last 5 or 10 years. Now think about that for a second. He reads hundreds of books. Wild is one of the best in the last 5 or 10 years. He went on to describe it as extraordinary and unforgettable, concluding that Wild is angry, brave, sad, self-knowing, redemptive, raw, compelling, and brilliantly written. And I think it's destined to be loved by a lot of people, men and women, for a very long time. Well, he was certainly right about that. The book has sold almost 2 million copies. It's been translated into more than 40 languages, and the paperback spent 2 years, more than 2 years, on the New York Times bestseller list. Wild was chosen as the inaugural selection for Oprah Winfrey's revived book club called Oprah's Book Club 2.0. And Nick Hornby wrote the screenplay for the 2014 movie directed by Jean-Marc Vallée, the Montreal director who had just come off the very successful Dallas Buyers Club. Vallée has also directed Café de Flore, Crazy, and most recently Demolition. One of the things that was very important to Jean-Marc Vallée in making this film was to use only available light, and that means shooting under difficult conditions or high-pressure circumstances, because you have something worth keeping in mind when you're watching the movie. For instance, they would have to get a particular scene in the can before the light changed, before the sun went down. Similarly, he insisted that Reese Witherspoon not be shown ahead of time how to set up a tent. She had to figure that out herself. And he also made sure that her backpack was stuffed with newspapers so it would be heavy. Probably not quite the, I don't know, Cheryl will tell, 75 pounds, I believe, that Cheryl actually carried. But nonetheless, she is under a very big pack, dubbed the Monster, as you'll see. The Pacific Crest Trail stretches across 9 mountain ranges from the California-Mexican border to British Columbia. Cheryl's route was 1,100 miles from the Mojave Desert to the Oregon-Washington border, but the movie was shot in 55 locations, mostly in Oregon. But just to be clear, Cheryl made the journey in 1995, and this is one of the things that appealed to Hornby. She didn't do it in order to write the book. Wild, From Lost to Found on the Pacific Crest Trail didn't come out until 17 years later. Cheryl Strayed was born in 1968 in central Pennsylvania, the second of 3 children. She grew up in the Midwest. She spent part of her childhood on 40 acres in Minnesota with no electricity or running water, but she had never hiked for more than a day at a time until she tackled the Pacific Crest Trail. She took the name Strayed when she and her first husband divorced. Her first novel, Torch, was published in 2006. Her last book was Tiny Beautiful Things, Advice on Love and Life from Dear Sugar, another book that Nick Hornby not only bought, but read and loved. It's a selection from her popular advice column for the online magazine Rumpus, which she now does as a podcast. Her latest title is Brave Enough, a book of quotations from her writings. Please welcome Cheryl Strayed.
Hi, everyone.
Now, within a few minutes of the start of the film, we see you, the real you, wishing your character good luck. How did that come about?
Well, first I want to say I learned when I was cast in this role that there are a lot of ways to say good luck. It's actually quite a hard thing to act, it turns out. But what happened is I was, as Eleanor said, the film was mostly shot in Oregon, where I live in Portland, Oregon. And I was on the set as much as I could be. I became dear friends with Jean-Marc Vallée and Reese Witherspoon and Laura Dern and Nick Hornby and everyone. So they actually wanted me on the set. Which was kind of cool. But and the whole time, every day Jean-Marc would say, Cheryl, we need to have you do your cameo. We always knew I would do a cameo. But we didn't know what? But we didn't know what. And days would go by and I would always say, we'll do it tomorrow. Because I was always going to lose 10 pounds by tomorrow. So we'll do it tomorrow. We'll do it tomorrow. Am I alone in this thought? So here we were, the very final day, and the only day we shot in California, was the last day of the shoot. And we actually went to the town of Mojave, where I checked into this motel the night before my hike. And we actually, in the movie, when you see Reese beginning her hike, sitting down on the side of the road, on the gravel on the side of the road, putting on her backpack, this is exactly where I began my hike. It was so moving to me to be back there. I hadn't been back there since I'd begun.
So almost 20 years?
Yeah. And those first steps she takes, that trail register she signs, that's all there. That's all exactly where I was. But here we were, and it was, that last day, then it was the afternoon of the last day, and suddenly everyone said, Cheryl has never done her cameo. And so we were about to shoot this scene that you're going to see at the very beginning of the film. This is one of the last scenes we shot, where, Reese is dropped off. There's a person who ends up being me, driving this beaten up old pickup truck. I think my title is Woman in Truck. And I had to drive this little truck, and Reese was in the passenger seat. And my job was to put on the brakes, wait till Reese got out of the truck, and then she would turn back and look at me, and I'd say, good luck. And so that's what we did. And we were about to lose the light. It was, that we were about to finish making this movie, and the light was fading from the sky, and I was in this truck, and we were about to start rolling, and I said to Reese Witherspoon, I'm actually pretty nervous about saying good luck, because I don't know how to say good luck all of a sudden. How should I say good luck? And this whole time, this whole shoot, all the other actors who had come along would say to me, Reese is just so sweet, and she put me at ease, and she's so calming, and so I said to her, Reese, do you have any advice for me? I'm really actually kind of scared. And she said, just don't fuck it up. I'm not kidding you. And so I was like, yeah, good luck, bitch. So I dropped her off and said, and what happened then that you won't see is she gets out of the truck, and because we were about to lose the light, there was just one more scene to shoot, and it was that she gets out of the truck and she walks into the little reception area of the motel where I dropped her off. And so what happened, and they decided to just keep going, just keep rolling. So she gets out, I say good luck, she walks into this little room, and I'm meant to just sit there quietly in this pickup truck while they're all like in this little reception area shooting. You'll see the scene that Reese has with this actress checking into the motel. And I'm sitting in the truck watching this happen about 15 feet away from me. And the sun is starting to melt into the sky over the mountain range to the west that is the Sierra Nevada and the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. And it's where the Pacific Crest Trail is. And suddenly I absorb the whole experience. I suddenly absorb everything that has happened. I remember being that woman who needed luck and who checked into that motel and who didn't know where she was going. And I remember being the woman who wrote the book. And I remember being the woman who went through this experience of having this movie made, of not just the book, but a really big part of my life. And I just wept. I just sat in that truck and I just wept. And it was for me like the moment of the film that I understood everything, that everything had come to a kind of fruition that I never would have expected. And it was a beautiful moment for me.
So how many takes did you have to do?
I think we did definitely Jean-Marc was like, okay, Cheryl, in his little French Canadian accent, Shirley, we were just a more gentle on the good luck. Because I was like, good luck. So I hope that you'll see what an amazing performance I gave. You're about to see it.
It's probably enough right there, but there is another member of your family in the movie.
Oh, yes.
Your daughter. So I think it'd be good for people to know.
Yes.
Your daughter plays a younger you. So how did that happen?
Yes. Okay. So how did this happen? My daughter Bobby. So see if you can follow this. So my daughter Bobby is named after my mother Bobby. So Reese was playing Cheryl, Laura was playing Bobby, Laura Dern, and Bobby was playing Cheryl, and I am Cheryl. So when we were on the set, the four of us, and Jean-Marc would go, Bobby, like everyone would look, or Cheryl, nobody knew who they were. But so my daughter was 8 when this was shot in the fall of 2013. And, Reese and the producer Bruna Papandrea and Jean-Marc Vallée all met, my kids. We were always, together. And they said, Bobby should try out for the audition for the role of little Cheryl. And so I first asked her if she was interested. And I told her that, of course, she would have to play, some happy scenes with Laura Dern, who plays my mother, and some pretty hard scenes with the man who plays my father. My father was abusive and violent and so forth. And she immediately said, I don't want to do it. And so we didn't push her. My husband and I just let it go. And then they kept auditioning kids. They couldn't find the right person, and she overheard us discussing this, how they couldn't find anyone. So she said, I want to do it. She changed her mind. And I tried to talk her out of it because of her original reluctance. But she went, she auditioned, she sent us from the room. My husband and I could not watch her audition. She was alone with Jean-Marc Vallée, and when they walked out, he said, we have found our Cheryl, our little Cheryl. And my daughter, it was really the most moving aspect of the experience for me, to see her reenacting the love I have for my mother, the way she met Laura Dern. There's going to be, as my daughter says, she's a memory, because she doesn't have any lines. She just, whenever Reese remembers her childhood, we see my daughter Bobby. And the way she met Laura Dern, she was just, Jean-Marc Vallée would do a lot of kind of scenes that he would just sort of pick up that weren't on the script, but he would just be like, let's shoot this. And we were shooting that day in an old schoolhouse, and he had Laura Dern go stand at the end of the hall. And Laura was dressed like my mom in the 70s, and she had a black eye, like the makeup people had put a black eye on her. And so my daughter was quickly introduced to Laura with the black eye, and Jean-Marc said to Laura, go stand at the end of the hall. And he said to my daughter, now when I say we're rolling, you run down the hall, and leap into Laura Dern's arms. And she was wearing pajamas and like as if she was getting ready for bed. And so Jean-Marc said, let's go. And suddenly I was just watching my daughter run down that hallway with such wild abandon and just throw herself into Laura Dern's arms. And they just held each other. And I had whatever those things are, I guess, headphones. Yeah, that's what they call them. I was in standing next to Jean-Marc, looking in the monitor, and I could hear the sounds that they were making. I could hear Laura and Bobby, who had just barely met each other, kind of both of them moaning with that sense of pleasure and love you do sort of when you really embrace somebody. And I and the whole crew just started weeping. Just again, weeping. Because it was, I think, this moment that we all recognized that this was what the film was really about, is that kind of, that real bond between this mother and daughter that would survive anything. And I love, and to me it was so touching to see my daughter, she got that opportunity to meet the grandmother she would never meet in the arms of Laura Dern. And in so many ways, I felt like that moment was like my mother's legacy. It was the thing that survived, that would go on without her. And so it was just that experience of seeing that was just powerful all around. I should also say my husband and son are also in the film, and if you look very closely, you will see them. When Reese Witherspoon in in the final scene of the film, she's finishing her trail at this place called the Bridge of the Gods, and she's walking off the trail and she's approaching the bridge, and a car goes past, and this man and boy are in the car and they wave to her and she waves back and looks back at them, and this was another scene where we didn't mean it to be so kind of like metaphorical, but we shot it, and I looked at Jean-Marc and I said, she's waving to her future. And this time it was Jean-Marc who was crying. He's a big cry-baby, just for the record. He cried like every day. And so there's a lot. It was a really sort of personal experience to me, and I'll talk more about it after the film. But it was the most surreal experience of my life to have a film made about my life. And for any of you, I totally recommend it. It's like, especially if you can get Reese Witherspoon to play you. So, yeah.
I haven't seen that ending for a long time. It's kind of cool watching it again.
What do you feel like when seeing those pictures of yourself?
The pictures. It's kind of wild. No, it's the pictures. It's really the end. The ending. It makes me emotional. No matter how many times I see it. It's just such a strange experience to see someone reenacting, like I said, some of the most powerful moments of your life, and then there it is on the big screen. And what strikes me about like that ending is just like how authentic it is to the actual experience. Mm-hmm.
And then seeing the snapshots of your younger self.
Exactly. It's pretty interesting to me. Yeah.
Reese Witherspoon she saw an advance copy of your book several months before it was published.
Yeah.
Why did you have it sent to her?
Well, I want to back up to answer one thing.
Sure.
That you just asked how it felt to watch it. One of the things that made me emotional, and I haven't told anyone this, you guys are getting this for the first time, that scene where the llama, and I'm running, that actually happened, I'm walking along and then suddenly there's a llama running at me. And then this old woman and this little boy who is strangely so polite. And one of the things that I experienced watching it is that if I were just seeing the movie and I hadn't read the book, but certainly if I hadn't lived the life, I would think that maybe in some ways the boy, that actor, is kind of like stiff and strange and overly formal, and that it's like a strangeness of the performance. But what's so cool about that scene for me is it's actually how he was. He was in part like the reason I never forgot that experience is that the boy was so polite like that. And he literally did look at me and say, "Would you like me to sing a song to you?" and all this. But a week ago, I got an email from a woman who said, "I'm friends with this woman, Sandy, who thinks that she's the woman you met with the llama, and she had a llama named Dancing Cloud." And I said, immediately emailed her back, and I said, "That's absolutely, it's Sandy." And I mean, because of course, when I actually lived these experiences, I wrote in my journal, like exactly their names and what happened. And I said, and she had a dog, her dog's name was Bernadette, right? And the woman's like, "Hold on, let me find out." And she's like, "Indeed, the dog's name is Bernadette, it was them." And I said, I've always wondered what happened to that little boy, because I was haunted by this boy who had a sad life, and he sang this beautiful song to me. And she emailed back and said he died in his early 20s of some drug kind of thing, which is heartbreaking. So it was watching that, I was like thinking about that. Yeah. But anyway, how did it get to Reese Witherspoon? I had finished Wild, the book, more than a year before it was published. I was just the sort of the way things happen in the publishing timeline. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they're just holding a book, and it was like, well, we don't want to publish it in the summer, and we don't want to publish it in the fall, and then pretty soon it's like, a year later, and that they're going to publish it. And so I was just sort of waiting for the book to come into the world, and I thought, well, I wonder if somebody in Hollywood wants it. So I talked to my literary agent, and she quickly hooked me up with Sherry Smiley, who's a film agent in Hollywood. And Sherry read the book, and she said, I think that yes, it can be a film, but the way to get a film made is, to get this film made, is to find an actress who's going to really want a strong role, an actress who can attach herself to it and actually get it made. And she said, I just happened to hear that Reese Witherspoon is looking for strong roles for women. She's putting together this production company with Bruno Papandrea. And this was like a Friday. And she said, Reese can read it over the weekend if you want her to. And I said, sure. And so then I went into my bedroom and I lit a candle. And it was one of those long burning candles. And I just decided to let it burn all weekend. And every time I passed it, I would say, Reese. And it's a true story.
Had you done this before?
No, I just
had it
decided,
worked?
what the hell? Let's just see if this works. I'm a kind of polytheist or whatever. I believe in every god and every bizarre hippie, thing. And so I was like, let's just see if this works. And so Monday morning, I got a phone call. And it was my agent, and she said, Reese read it and wants to talk to you. She really wants to make this movie. She wants to star in it and produce it. And so within a few days, Reese and I had our first conversation, and we talked at length about the books she loved, the writers she loved, the movies she loved, and why she would be the best person to bring this to the screen. And from the very beginning, there was just an affinity that I sensed that she was somebody I could trust. And she has proven to be that way.
And when you wrote the book, did you always conceive of it as a movie?
No. I can't speak for all writers, but I can't imagine doing that. It's hard enough to write a damn book. You also have to envision the film, So, I think that I was obviously just really, everything that's in the book, the way it's in the book, it's there because that's what a book demands. And then, that translation to film is a different endeavor entirely.
How involved were you in the translation to film? You mentioned earlier that you were on the set and so on, but how much did you work with Nick Hornby? Did you go through drafts? What was your relationship?
So Nick and I, he reached out to me as soon as the book was published. Really, within the first week, I got this wonderful email from Nick, and he just said nice things about the book. And at this point, he wasn't involved with the film at all. But a few months later, I got Reese said, "Listen, we're going to ask Nick to write the script." And Nick, he's such a gentleman. He's such a good person. He emailed me and said, I will only do it if you approve. I'll only take the job if you approve. And of course, I was
he
ecstatic.
approached her.
He approached her behind the scenes.
Yeah.
But it was wonderful. So from the beginning, they were very inclusive. They cared what I thought. And so he wrote the first draft, and then he sent it to me, and I talked to him about it. And then there was another draft. And then, with each draft of the script, I was invited to weigh in. And it's a delicate process. It's a really interesting process to, give feedback to another writer about not only your book adaptation,
but a book that's about
but
you.
But it's my life, and that's the other layer of it. I think it's very different to have a novel adapted than a memoir, because obviously it's still a big deal. But that character is me, and all the people in the film are real people. They're playing actual people who have lives. And so I was very nervous about that, but also trusting this group of people who were in this, doing this. It was
How many drafts did he go through?
Well, it's always hard to say because, as you know, when you're on the set, things happen too. Mm-hmm. So I would guess, I think it seems like a good 3 or 4 drafts. And then once Jean-Marc Vallée came on board, then there was another round of edits that they did together, revisions and conversations that they had together. And then on the set, in real life, you're there saying, well, Reese is like, well, should I say this or that? Or, so there were a lot of things like that happened as we were shooting. And I was there. Nick wasn't on the set then. And so I was there, sort of weighing in on that as well.
And when you say you're weighing in looking at the drafts, were there disagreements? Or when you came in with something, did Nick go with it? Or what kind of interaction was there?
There were things in the first draft that I, strongly recommended he change.
Can you say what, for instance?
For instance, well, I think that there was, first of all, one thing, the difference between the book and the movie is in the film I have no sister or stepfather, and in real life
Right.
I did. So they actually changed my family structure.
Mm-hmm.
And one,
But
I think,
you just had a younger brother, which is what you do.
yeah.
Yeah.
But I think the initial idea was for me to be an only child. And I was so,
To
I said,
simplify the plot? Or
yeah,
something?
to simplify the plot. And I really felt that that it was that was such a different kind of dynamic that's where I said, please consider, bringing the brother back in. And here's why. I made my case. And what was beautiful is, obviously it's writing is such a process anyway. You go in one round and then two rounds. And then, so it was never like I was telling Nick or anyone what they had to do. It was that what I felt passionately about fighting for I did, and then other things I accepted and let go. I always was very clear about the idea that the book was mine and the film was somebody else's.
And the book, with such a big book, inevitably things get cut.
Yeah.
Was there anything that you miss or that you wish could have been included?
Yeah, I think that that some of the nuance of like who I was in terms of like the nature of my promiscuity, I think in the film it's done in a really kind of shorthand fashion. For example, in the film, you see me having sex in an alley with two men, which I have never done, just for the record. I have that to look forward to. But
Sex in an alley with one man or no?
either. I might have had sex in an alley with one man, but I've never. But things like that where I understand, why Jean-Marc Vallée and Nick, they had to sort of make a shorthand for those years that then I think I wrote about with the nuanced nature that you can, when you have 10 pages to explain that era of your life versus 30 seconds on the screen. And so it wasn't that I didn't, I don't understand those choices. It's just that some of those scenes make me squirm a little. And it's always the scenes where there's a departure from what is true. Because, of course, a lot of you, how many of you have just seen the movie and not read the book? Okay. So those of you who just saw the movie, what you think you know about me is based on that, which is an interpretation of this text, which really is the real story. So it's an interesting thing to have to kind of let go of and accept, because it does become who Cheryl Strayed is in the minds of, a certain audience.
You were just 22 and a senior in college when your mother died, and you've described this loss as your Genesis story. In what way?
Well, when my mom died, my life, the life as I knew it, ended. And I had to learn how to live in the world without my mom. And I knew that when my mom died. I knew the day she died, I knew that was true. And she's been dead now for more than 25 years. And it's still true. Like, I wasn't mistaken about that. And I think that the thing I was mistaken about was that I didn't feel like I could live without my mother. And I've learned that that's not true. But it is true that life as I knew it ended. The world without the most essential people in our lives is a different world. And I think especially, I lost my mom at this moment when I was technically an adult, and yet I completely still needed my mother. And, because I didn't have a father, my mother had sort of stood in for every, for both the mother and the father. And when she died, it was like there was just this enormous loss in my life, this enormous gap that would never be filled and that never has been filled, And my family also died with my mother. My family was never resurrected.
Your siblings?
Yeah, I love my siblings and we're, we have a perfectly friendly relationship, but we don't have a family anymore.
But to say a Genesis story suggests birth. That's...
Yes.
So
well, and that's
is this kind of optimistic take on it, or a hard-won optimism, or how would you describe it? Like, why that word?
It was the beginning. When the thing about an ending is, even if it's an ending you don't want, it's inevitably the beginning of something else. And it was the beginning of everything else, And the other way I talk about this being my Genesis story is, as a writer, this death of my mother and this grief story is something I return to again and again, often against my will. My first book is a novel called Torch. Have any of you read Torch? All right, I have a couple of real fans. Thank you. So those of you who have read the book know it's fiction, and it really is fiction. It's more fictional than people assume it is, because what it's about is a woman who dies young of cancer in northern Minnesota, and her family's grief. And so it's very autobiographical at the same time that it's very fictional. And I felt so much like that was the book I had to get out of my system so I could move on, and as an artist and a person. And so when I first started writing Wild, I distinctly remember being, maybe 50 pages into the book, writing about the hike, and I remember saying to my husband, it's such a relief that I'm finally writing a book that has absolutely nothing to do with my mother. And I really thought that for a little bit. And then there again, it comes up, and there is my mother. And so in some ways, that Genesis story, what I mean by that is like, I'm just always going back to the origins of like how I came to be. And it's so connected to my mother's death, that I sort of had to rise out of the ashes of that sorrow. And I did, I did. I mean, when I say I lost my family, I also have a family now. I gained my family. And I came to peace with that early loss,
I mean, you were, understandably devastated, shattered, I think is the word you used. But did it surprise you what direction your self-destruction took, like sex and drugs and?
That's interesting. Well, there's only a couple of options. It's either sex, drugs, or rock and roll.
Yeah, exactly.
So, really, I guess not. I think that in so many ways, sex is such a kind of easy way to find what feels a little bit like love, and a lot like pleasure, and a lot like having power or being wanted, at this time when I think it was feeling so alone and not so much rejected, but abandoned, which is a deeper kind of rejection. And so it's a pretty, like, I look back on it now, I can see so clearly why I did those things. And drugs, the thing about heroin that was really interesting to me and remains so is that I didn't understand really why people use drugs until I used heroin. And then I thought, this is it. There's this wonderful morphine song called The Cure for Pain. And they sing about, like, essentially this terrible drug that destroys people's lives. The first thing it does is it actually cures your pain for at least a little while. And that's why people use it. That's why people do it, And certainly that was the thing that I touched when I, used heroin. I was like, who knew that there was this world that I could live without this sorrow? Which, of course, then is crazy because it only becomes a bigger sorrow. But that little glimmer of truth at the beginning was alluring. And I'm so grateful that I didn't go all the way down that path. I got myself out before it was, became life-threatening. But that was, those two sort of the sex and drugs. That's why people do. We've done this throughout time, right?
By the end of
what about you? Have you ever done the sex and drugs thing?
I am such a goody two-shoes. You don't even want to know about it.
Are you really?
Yeah.
How about the rock and roll? You have a band, right?
I would like to sing with a band. It's true, but.
So what do we say? Eleanor is going to front somebody's band. Somebody has a band in this room.
Actually, you would be amazed the number of writers, mostly male, who have thought or had wanted to be
in a
singers
band with
with
you?
rock and roll. No, not with me, but in their lives, like Ian McEwan and Kazuo Ishiguro, and so many.
Really?
You interview these guys, and it turns out they say, "Oh, I became a writer because I couldn't be, I didn't succeed as a rock and roll star." Or
Got
like
it.
That,
Yeah,
that kind of.
I
thing.
never wanted to be in a band. No. I was too busy doing sex and drugs
Obviously.
for any rock and roll.
But by the end of the Pacific Crest Trail, you'd sobered up. You'd sworn off one-night stands. You essentially went from trauma to transformation. But I read somewhere you said that you were still the same person as when you started.
Very much so. I mean, that's the funny, weird thing. I think I do this too. We all want to think. It's more comfortable for us to think in extremes and in black and white. Like, I would never do this, and I like that. There's the bad Cheryl was the crazy, reckless one who didn't know anything and was totally destructive and totally messed up. And then like she goes and hikes the trail, and then she's like the Buddha. It's like Charles Manson becomes the Buddha, and it's a very familiar trajectory in narratives throughout time. It's a very familiar trajectory in Hollywood. And when I was writing Wild, what I wanted to try to do is to write a true story of transformation, which I think is so much more discreet than in real life than it is in these kind of stories that we all have all absorbed on some higher level. And it was, if you knew me then, I have a lot of friends who knew me then and know me now, and I was like Cheryl in a messed up time in my life, but I was still me, and then I got myself together. I was in a hard time in my life, and then I wasn't in a hard time in my life. I gathered myself and gathered myself and found my strength again. I didn't find a new strength. I found the strength that had always been there, that I couldn't access in my suffering. And so it's really so much. I think my journey, I'm not singular in this way. I think that all of your journeys, like we all have hard times, and then the way to pull yourself out is you don't have to become somebody else. You have to let yourself be the person you really are inside. And that can be incredibly difficult to do. But that's to me what real transformation is.
But you said that you never imagined that Wild would be read as inspirational. I mean, what did you think readers would take from it?
I don't know. It's interesting for me to try to remember. That's true. Like, it didn't, when I was writing it, I was not thinking, wow, everyone's just gonna be so inspired by how like awesome I am. I was like, I'm just gonna try to tell the truth about this experience. And to me, what I was trying to tap into was essentially, I was trying to answer this question: how do we bear the unbearable? And what was really cool about being able to write about a backpacking trip on which I took an incredibly heavy backpack, that I could actually write in literal terms about the metaphor I was working on and trying to answer as a writer. Because one thing we know is it always hurts to bear what we can't bear, and we're always capable of doing it. And this is a true story throughout time. It's something all of us have had to be, in some metaphorical sense, that woman alone in the motel room who can't lift the pack and then does. And so, this is also why it took me so long to even think about writing the book, because until I sort of tapped into that this story was about something other than me, I didn't want to tell it. It was an interesting dinner party conversation to tell you about my PCT hike, but it wasn't art. And I feel like memoir really asks us, and so does fiction, to tell a story, a very intimate story about a particular life that also resonates with lives across time and place and gender and, culture. I wanted to tell like a sort of an ancient universal story by way of this experience I had. And that's what I was trying to do. Whether I did it or not, I don't know. I was so focused on trying to do well that I wasn't thinking about like what people would think of it when they read it. So it's such an impossible question to even answer. What did you think people would take from it? I felt like it was none of my business. My business was to try to do the best I could do.
It was more the surprise at people taking inspiration, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, what I wanted what like I think every artist and maybe every person wants, and that's just like for everyone on the fucking planet to love me.
Because you said that you did go out on a spiritual quest, but what you got was a physical test, and that you hadn't understood that they were related.
Yeah.
But when you obviously had to find the discipline and the strength, like you say, it was in yourself, but you had to find that to keep going, to do it.
Yeah. I mean, they're so connected. That was it. Is before my hike, I was thinking about the kind of like, I'll be in nature and I'll It'll be so pretty, and we all feel very peaceful in nature, which most of us don't actually feel peaceful in nature because you're being like devoured by mosquitoes, or some terrible thing is happening with the wind or the sun or right. And but I had this idea of the kind of peace, the serenity that we do sometimes feel in nature. And I got out there, and it was so much about the elements and so much about the struggle and strife of the hike that I, it took me a while to see that indeed that was exactly what I needed for that spiritual redemption or that spiritual transformation I was seeking. It was about actually getting out of my head and into my body. And it was enacting in a physical way what I needed to do in an emotional way, which is just simply to, put one foot in front of the other and keep going. It's very literal. It's a strange thing. I had to kind of really try to not overuse that kind of metaphor, with the weight of the pack
burden
and
the
moving
baggage
forward.
you're carrying.
It ends
too
ends up
neat.
being exactly. I had to sort of lighten that a bit.
But what frightened you most? I mean, there was so much that seems pretty scary, but when were you most terrified?
When I didn't have any water, and it was, like 102 degrees or something, and I didn't have any water. And that was for sure the most dangerous time, the most dangerous day of my hike. And that was, it was something, it was like one of those things. It wasn't totally my fault, and ultimately it was kind of my fault. I believed there was going to be water in this place where there was not water. There was supposed to be water. I was told there was water. And I learned a lesson that day. That you can't, you just have to always be careful in that regard. So that was really scary. I was also scared, when I met the two men, the only two people I met along the way who were unkind to me or who meant me harm,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was scary too.
You read 13 books on the trail.
I did.
And how did you choose what to take or what to read or what to trade?
One of the things about, as you said in the introduction, is, I just took this hike because I wanted to take a hike. I wasn't taking this hike thinking, and I'm going to write a best-selling memoir about it. I was like, okay, in retrospect, I would have had a great answer to your question of I chose these books because this, but I just was living life. And so what I did is I took a little stroll down my bookshelf and thought, I've always, wanted to read this and that. It's kind of like Nick Hornby, the books he bought and the books he read. So they were just random books that I had bought at some point and never gotten around to reading and had always wanted to. So there wasn't any master plan. It was just books that I owned and thought it would be interesting to read them. The one exception is Adrienne Rich's The Dream of a Common Language, which I took with intention because it was such an important book to me.
And it's the only book that you
Carried the whole way.
Carried the whole way.
Yeah.
Luckily, a thin book.
Thin
book of poetry.
Yeah.
Because quite almost provocatively at the back of Wild, books burned on the PCT.
That's right.
So
I know, I'm a book burner. It's terrible. So have you read most of the books I took on the trail?
No, it's mixed. No, I've read some of them. There's I've not read the James Michener. I share that.
Okay. You've been a James Michener snob?
Yeah.
Okay. Have any of you read James Michener? He's a good guy. A funny thing about James Michener, I wrote the book, and then there's all this stuff that has come to me, after the fact. And there's that scene that's both in the movie and the book where this guy from the Hobo Times interviews me. And what's so funny is Vanity Fair magazine dug into this to be who's the guy who interviewed Cheryl from the Hobo Times? And they, unearthed all this stuff. They found the guy, actually. He's dead, but they found his family, and they're all like, yeah, he's in that book Wild. And they knew it was him right away. But what they did is they went to the Hobo Times and said, did you ever publish this piece about me? And they hadn't. But what I found out is the guy who funds the Hobo Times, which is a real thing, is James Michener.
Really?
James Michener. So James Michener was a hobo, actually. Or he had some era of his life that he was a hobo, and he always loved the hobos. And so he supports, he left the whole endowment like the Hobo
No,
Times.
he's a
Yeah.
good guy. He endowed.
But you won't read his
a short.
books.
No, it's not a matter of principle. He endowed a short story competition in Canada, and there's something called the Journey Prize, and it's a prize given to short story writers that have been published in literary magazines
Yeah.
in Canada. So no, he's
a good guy.
He writes big fat novels, and I'm a slow reader. That's really what it comes down to.
I get it. I'm just teasing you.
I know. What made you decide to write an advice column?
I just.
This is a Dear Sugar thing in the rumpus.
Dear Sugar, yeah, it was completely a lark. I was asked to write the advice column, and it was for no pay, which basically was like my job description up until really. I was like, oh, okay, I'll do it. It was really just, it sounded interesting because it was something I'd never done, and I'd never hardly even read advice columns aside from the casual things in the newspaper once in a while. I like to do things that maybe are kind of ill-advised and that like seem like a good idea and then turn into a bad idea. That's kind of like, and then it always ends up being a really good idea.
But you obviously had the confidence to feel you could give advice?
No, I it was more like, think about what is advice. Like from the very beginning, I said to readers, like, listen, what's always the case. It's always just one person's perspective on what you've told them and what you think. It's not like nobody's the voice of authority. Nobody's the voice of God, not even God. You know what I mean? It's just like there are so many different sources of information that you can gather from people, and the ones that are true are the ones that ring true to you. And so I never felt like I was positioning myself in a place of kind of superiority or authority.
Yeah, no,
I always just thought, I'll just try to grapple with this question, which is really what writers throughout time have done. Let's look at this situation and see what happens. And that's exactly what I do all the time, every day that I write. I'm saying, I'm putting people, either real or imagined, in a situation, and we're going to see what happens. And so in some ways that kind of work, where I'm always thinking like, not just who are we, but who are we really? Like, what is the nature? What's our nature when we're at our best and our worst and our, and so that's what an advice columnist does, is really sort of look at things from all sides and look very deeply.
Would you ever recommend to someone writing for advice that they walk the PCT?
Yes, absolutely. Some people I just wish I could like make them do it. Really.
The Nazi advice columnist. That was the.
That's right. No, like sometimes, do you guys ever have this where you have a friend and like every once in a while you're just like, if they would just do what I tell them to do, there would be no problem. And and it's sometimes somebody's up there waving like, you're like, but and the thing about like hiking the PCT, I met this woman, maybe she's in the audience, who hiked a bunch of the PCT last summer. Hillary, are you in the audience? I was like, so yeah, like I didn't even have to ask her because I already know the answer, but I asked her anyway. And she was like, yeah, it's the best thing I've ever done. And pretty much everyone I meet who has hiked a long trail says that. So it is one of those things. It's kind of like, okay, you're at odds. You don't know what to do with your life. You're, unhappy or whatever. Just like go hike the PCT and talk to me in 6 months and you'll tell me it's the best thing you've ever done. And it's sometimes that simple. You
have a Canadian connection.
Yes.
You're looking doubtful, but it's because of you wrote a pushcart prize. You won a pushcart prize for an essay you wrote called Monroe Country, about a letter you received from Alice Munro.
Yes.
Tell me about that.
Well, I love Alice Alice Munro. She is my favorite author of all time. And when I discovered her when I was like 20, and I was an undergraduate at the University of Minnesota, and I had never seen myself reflected on the page, on the pages of a book the way I did when I read Alice Munro. Even though she's older than me, she grew up in Southern Ontario. I grew up in Northern Minnesota. They're very much the same place. I feel like an honorary Canadian. Will you guys adopt me? And I just was so amazed by the stories she told about the kind of people who I really knew, good country people who had lives more complicated than I'd ever seen depicted anywhere else. And I wrote about my love for her. I wrote about finding her and loving her for that reason, feeling in some ways seen by her and inspired by her, that like I could tell stories about these sorts of people too. But then my mom died, and Alice Munro also lost her mom young. And I really felt her work about in those stories that she's written about mother loss really deeply too. So there are all these ways that I just felt like, I knew her and she knew me. And so when I was like 23, I had written a short story. It's my first published short story. It's called The House with the Horse and the Blue Canoe. And I hope you can't find it online. And I entered a contest, and I won. I mean, I entered in a contest and I won. And the prize was that it would be published in this anthology, and I would get like $1,500, which was astounding. And the guy who called me to tell me I won, he said to me, okay, it's going to be in this book, and we're going to send you 2 copies, one for you and one for your mom. And I hung up the phone, and I was so happy I'd won, but I was so pierced by this idea that I would always get 2 copies of everything I ever did. And I would never be able to give that copy to my mother, the mom copy. I would never be able to send it to her. So I wrote the first fan letter of my life. I wrote to Alice Munro, and I told her why I loved her and wrote all about her stories. And I told her I wanted to send her I included with the letter a copy of this book that had my first short story in it. And I told her that I didn't expect her to read it. She didn't need to read it. I just wanted her to receive it because she'd been a kind of literary mother to me. And I sent it to her. Didn't expect anything in return. And about 2 weeks later, a letter from her showed up in my mailbox. And she wrote this beautiful letter to me about my short story, which now just makes me I almost died then, but even still, I can't believe she wrote to me. But she did. And so the essay begins with this letter. She gave me permission to publish it in the essay that I wrote many years later. And it really is, I go on to write about her influence in my life, and also the way that in some ways I had to let her go. When I was 10 years later, almost finished with my first book, but really struggling, I had to finally say, okay, Alice Munro, I love you, and I can't be you. I kept wanting to be Alice Munro, and I learned that I could only be Cheryl Strayed, and to let go of the people who we've loved, or let go of our influences in some ways, was a big moment for me, and a big point of that essay.
Just a last question. You changed your name from Nyland to Strayed. Now that you're happily married, have 2 children for these many years, do you think that maybe Strayed doesn't fit so much anymore?
It's funny. A lot of people have asked me that, and nothing could be further from the truth. I feel like even back then, I didn't take on Strayed for any negative connotation. I made that name because I felt like it in so many ways spoke to who I was and was becoming. And it feels like, that I made my own heritage in some way by naming myself or defining myself. And so, I feel like I've, if anything, grown into the name, not away from it, but into it. And, my middle name is Nyland. I just bumped over my name one notch. And so I still have that sense of there's obviously that sense of heritage, but my daughter's middle name is Strayed. And just the other day she was like, what if I make it my last name, Mom? Am I allowed to do that? And I just laughed. Who knows? Yeah. So do you think it's what makes you think that what provoked you to ask the question?
I guess I assume you took the name because you had strayed from, from your marriage, or strayed from the conventional everything that you had, where you thought you had been headed and were no longer. So it just seems like you had found yourself more than.
But strayed into, I think, this idea of into that life that came next after that Genesis story. What would be the last name you would choose for yourself if you had to choose one for yourself?
I don't know. My surname in German means quail.
Okay.
So it's quite nice. Like I used to think I'd write historical romances under the name Eleanor Quayle, but then Dan Quayle came along and ruined it.
Yeah. Yeah, Eleanor Quayle, that was
That's
your
a
romance
perfect-
name?
what- yeah.
We need something
Isn't
much
that,
hotter
no,
than
but
that.
isn't it a perfect romance name?
Yeah, yeah. I when I was in graduate school, I was trying to make quick money, and I had this idea that I could write these kind of like bodice ripper short stories and sell them. And of course, I would do it under a pen name. So I spent like a whole month writing this whole bunch of these like really terrible, like embarrassing, like romantic, hot short stories. And my pen name was Ginger Nile.
Oh, instead of Nile.
But
Yeah.
what happened is they all got rejected. So
That was
failed.
the-
I was a fail. I'm a failed bodice ripping.
Oh, you see,
writer.
I'm just still a fantasy romance writer.
Yeah.
You're a
I'm like
you're-
a failed romance writer.
Yeah.
So
Can't all
maybe
win,
there's
you
still
know.
hope for you.
Yeah. We're going to open to questions from the audience. Wait till you receive the microphone, please, before you begin to speak.
Hey there.
Hi.
As a follow-up to the Hobo Times, would you still describe yourself as a feminist? And, well, why or why not? And what's the last great book you've read?
I am a feminist, absolutely. And I have been since I learned the word when I was like 6. Let's see, I'm always reading books before they're published. Here's a book that just came out that I really enjoyed. It's called Lab Girl. I think it's out here too now. It's just, right? Lab Girl by Hope Charon. Yes? Is somebody saying yes? They know it? All right. I really like that book. I know H is for Hawk. I know that Helen McDonald is coming. It's a wonderful book. Both memoirs and both, that I love them both.
Hi. After you went on your initial journey on the trail and then you went on to write your book and later have it adapted into a film, do you find that your memories of the first journey and how you remember has changed?
That's a great question. The thing is I know that it has because, science tells us it does. Every time we remember something, the memory in some way changes. And certainly now things get influenced by like writing about it. And, when you decide to include one thing, you sort of omit other things and then they fall away. And then, again, seeing it on the screen, it forms a different kind of memory. But, one of the things I will say about memory that I found to be really fascinating is I think that so often we have this experience that we think we've forgotten everything. Like people often ask me, well, how could you have written about that time that was so long ago? And, one of the things is I did keep a journal. And so I like that scene I just described with the llama. As soon as I finished talking to those people, I wrote down everything that happened because I was so struck by what happened. And so I could call on that document. But a lot of times, I didn't write things down and I just was writing wild and I would begin to write about something and then suddenly more memories would emerge. And I liken it to like when you run into an old friend, somebody you knew 25 years ago, and suddenly you're talking about old times. And at first you don't remember all the old times. And then when you're prompted by those conversations, suddenly you're like, oh yeah, that too. And that's what the writing process is like, that you begin from what you remember, and then what's interesting is the world opens up to you. And what I found, when I could, I would get in touch with the people I'm, wrote about and say, will you tell me what you remember, like about when we met or, this experience we had? And way more often than not, everything they remembered was what I remembered, down to like great detail. Like the 3 young bucks, I got in touch with them and asked them to just tell me about our time together. And there was nothing that they remembered differently than me. And it was even crazy, things that like crazy ranger, in real life, he was way crazier than in the movie. Like really crazy. And we all remembered exactly like what he said and what we were drinking and what we ate. And, when you're that hungry on the trail too, you never forget every single thing you ate. You're like, remember they gave us a hot dog? I totally remember that. And so, memory gets a bad rap that I actually found that more often than not, that like we all remembered the same thing. So it was kind of reassuring, because I did worry about that a lot when I was writing it. You know, I wanted to be as factual as possible, even though obviously it's all my subjective point of view, my subjective memory.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wondered how you found the courage to share this immensely personal story with the world, and particularly with the book. How did it feel to finally let it go?
Right. Well, I had practice. I mean, one of the things that preceded Wild, you know, it was like, honestly, you know, 15 or 20 years of being a writer. And so it wasn't like the first time I wrote about myself was in Wild. I had been writing about myself in essays, you know, long before that. And also in fiction and short stories. And, you know, even though, like I said, my first book, Torch, is fiction, it's also, you know, I wrote about some pretty deep, intimate stuff that comes from a place of, you know, real life and really me. And so it's like a muscle you work. You learn how to be intimate and vulnerable in a really public space as a writer. You know, I still, when I write really personal things, like the moment it's published, like my first thought is, how do I purchase all the copies of this, you know, book or this magazine or whatever? And yet what I've found too is, you know, is that when you do publish things like that, you know, what you're afraid of is condemnation, judgment. But what I've found is usually what you get are a whole lot of people who write to you and say, thank you so much. Me too. I know what you're talking about. And so, you know, in some ways the readers have made me stronger as a writer in that way. They've made me braver. Yeah.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
This is loud. I recently read Tiny Beautiful Things, which I found cathartic for myself to the point it had me crying on the subway.
Thank you.
Which is fun. For
I
you
love
as a
making
writer,
people cry.
it wasn't a good look. For you as a writer, was it cathartic in a different sense writing that than it was for Wild?
You know, I feel like that all of my books, I used to say, no, you know, writing is not cathartic. In so many ways, I was trying to defend my position as an artist. I was trying to get people to take me seriously or to think about me seriously, rather than sort of pigeonholing me the way a lot of women writers throughout time have been like, oh, she writes about her feelings, you know. And I was like, no, it is art with a capital A. And what I realized with the passage of time, and as I grew more confident in myself, like that feeling of like not needing to sort of prove myself as a writer, as that diminished, I was able to sort of admit, you know, the thing is I am making art, and that is my first objective. And it also ends up being like the most cathartic thing in my life. You know, that when I'm writing, I'm trying to do that thing I was just talking about with Eleanor. Like I'm trying to answer those really big questions about like who are we really? What does it mean to be human? What does it mean to struggle and suffer and love and all of that stuff? And so, you know, I am always visiting those really deep places, both within myself and also pondering them in other people. Like the form of the advice column, what I loved about that when I was writing it is that I would hold other people's stories and tell my own and try to, you know, find meaning in that kind of union. And like I said, when I was writing memoir, it was always, okay, I'm going to tell you my story, but I'm actually trying to tell you our story. And so they feel really the same to me. Same with fiction. I mean, believe it or not, fiction feels like that to me too. Even though those characters are invented in my mind, I have such a personal connection to them. They feel like real people to me. And so it always feels like something enormous is at stake, and that it's emotional and ultimately very cathartic to me when I go, you know, all the way there, wherever that may be. Thanks for crying on the subway. Yes.
Hi, I'm lucky enough to have a grown-up daughter who introduced me to canoe camping in the wilderness. And I wondered if you've done other smaller hikes, and what do you do with your daughter if she goes with you, or?
Yeah, I've done a lot of, well, I grew up in northern Minnesota, so I canoed a lot. And I lived, you know, in the wilderness, and I didn't have indoor plumbing, all through my high school years. And so, I had a lot of experience in the wilderness. I just had never gone backpacking. And the thing about a canoe is that, like, it carries the weight of all your crap, whereas the backpacking is like such a different thing for me to have it on my back.
Portage.
That's right, for portage, that's a different thing. But, I love to still do all kinds of things in the outdoors. And my kids, I have a son and a daughter, they come with me. We haven't, this summer we're going to go on our first like real backpacking trip where the kids are going to like carry things. Up until now we've been like luxury, like we'll like rent a yurt, and then make them go hiking all day with us and stuff. And they complain and then they love it. And, so I do try to share that with my kids for sure, because I think it's a wonderful thing. It's one of those things that I call it retrospective fun, that like it might not always be fun in the moment, right? No, this is a real thing, okay? Retrospective fun, okay? Anyone who's a runner knows what I'm talking about, okay? Like running, like it's like not usually super fun while you're doing it. It might be fun like for like 5 minutes, while you're listening to some great song in your headphone or something. But the rest of the time, if you're like me, I'm like, oh my God, when will this end? And, and same with hiking, like it's beautiful and it's fabulous, but it's also hard. And you're like, why did we decide to go this far? And you're on one of those loops that you're like, I'm sure that we've taken a wrong turn because the loop is like double in length than you thought it would be. And, and then later you're like, that was amazing, right? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? So I have really encouraged, and this, even travel. Like travel's such a pain in the butt sometimes, but then later you're like, that was an amazing adventure. And so I try to teach my kids to really pursue retrospective fun.
Where are you taking them on the walk this time? Is it in Oregon?
Yeah, we're gonna. So up on Mount Hood, actually, not far from a lot of the stuff you saw, like when Reese is in the opening scene when the boot goes over and stuff. That's Mount Hood, the Mount Hood Wilderness area, and we're gonna do a loop around Mount Hood. Yeah.
We have time for a last question over here.
Hi, Cheryl.
Hi.
Tiny Beautiful Things is the book that I give to my friends when I know they're going through a hard time. Is there a book that you recommend to your friends when they're going through a hard time?
Oh, thank you. That's so sweet. That's interesting. Nobody's ever asked me that. No, but yet I always give friends books when they're going through a hard time, because I do think like books have been my greatest consolation. Books are what I turn to when I am, blue or lost or wondering what to do next. And I try to think about, I have different books that I give to different friends at different times. I often, I love Mary Oliver and her poetry. She's such a great source of wisdom and beauty. I love Adrienne Rich and her poems. I've given many people Alice Munro's books. I tend to try to just like the books I love, share them with people. But thank you for giving Tiny Beautiful Things to your friends. That's very sweet of you.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you all for coming. Cheryl will be signing books outside. And Cheryl, thank you so much. Really a pleasure.